We're going to be talking first about hope. And I thought this might just be a nice place to start. Emily Dickinson wrote this poem as somebody who really, in some ways, had a pretty hard, difficult life, a lot of despair. I'm wondering if there's anybody who would like to read this poem for us. Go ahead.
Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all.
And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm.
I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asks a crumb of me.
Thank you. Yeah, I like this poem. I feel like it embodies a kind of resilient hope, which is what we're going to be talking about. So I have a quick question. Now that you can see my screen, can you also see me? Yes, okay, all right, good, that's good. That's what I was hoping that the answer would be. All right, so that makes it a little bit easier. I don't have to switch back and forth quite so much, but just to kind of move forward into the workshop itself, I want to sort of give everybody this overview here. When the affinity group from Extinction Rebellion and I met, we identified a lot of different things that we wanted to talk about. And we narrowed it down for today to these 3 areas. The first one was about hope and a resilient kind of hope. The second part will be about resilience in general, a more general understanding of resilience, and a kind of resilience journey that I'm going to lead you through. And then the last part will be more specific to messaging and outreach strategies, which we're going to relate all of these things to the pandemic as well. So it'll be a both and in terms of hope, resilience, and messaging. Okay, so the first part again is about this idea of resilient hope. Resilient hope is, I think, a kind of part of resilience in general. And so talking about resilience, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Okay, and I want to talk about the idea of resilience. How many people do we have on this call? Okay, this is just a hand, it's not a huge number. So that means we can have a little bit of conversation together, which is great. Does anybody feel like naming some of the aspects? When you think of the word resilience, what do you think of? A long time. Surviving for a long time. Can you say that again, Nicole, a little bit louder?
Like a long, like surviving for a long time, like
Okay.
the steadiness.
So a truly sustainable kind of. Go ahead, Eleanor. I think you might be muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Adaptability.
Yeah,
Being
kind
able
of
to handle different kinds. Yeah, different circumstances change, but you remain stable.
Mm-hmm.
I think of bouncing back when something difficult happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all great aspects of resilience. People, I'm gonna go to the sharing again. People have ways of thinking about resilience. Usually it has to do with adversity. So usually resilience is defined as something that people have or don't have or are able to embody or not in the face of adversity. Sometimes when people talk about resilience, they talk about recovering from adversity. But sometimes it's more about being able to move through adversity with resilience the whole time. Does that make sense? So sometimes people experience things that are difficult and they're able, like someone was saying, maybe it was Rachel, they're able to rebound from it. Or as Eleanor was saying, they're able to be flexible and adapt. sometimes people are able to face adversity already with a lot of resilient skills, and there's less bouncing back that's needed. And sometimes people are even able to be in a place of groundedness and peace and joy in the face of what at another time in their life or for another person would not be possible. So those are the kinds of ways that we're talking about resilience. And when we're talking about hope, it's important to remember that those two kind of frames that I just mentioned, sometimes we're in a place of despair and we're able to find a place of hope. And sometimes we're able to find a place where we don't even need to go through that. We can just have the tools and the skills that we've built over time to be grounded and joyful and hopeful, even in the face of despair and adversity, so that we don't need the adversity to stop. We don't need the adversity to end in order for us to recover. Does that make sense? I'm going to look over here so I can see all your faces for a minute. Okay. All right. So on the slide that you can see I have some barriers to resilience, and they're sort of categorized in 3 areas. One of them is more a psychological kind of areas, the denial, the overwhelm, and the despair. One of them is more practical in terms of the preparedness or unpreparedness in terms of feeling resilience and the ability to feel hopeful. And then the other one has to do with cohesion. And then when we have not just societal, but ecological cohesion or incohesiveness, and our ability to be resilient and hopeful in the face of adversity or in the midst of adversity. Okay, so we're going to talk more about resilience, but we're going to talk more about hope at the moment. Resilience is, we're going to save a lot of that for part 2. Okay, so now we're going to talk about resilient hope. Defining hope. All right, so kind of developing a love-hate relationship with sharing my slides. But if you saw that slide flash up really quickly, you saw that I kind of divided hope into 2 main categories. One was an attached kind of hope, and one is a non-attached kind of hope. I think that's probably sort of obvious, but we're going to talk about that for a few minutes, because when people think about hope, a lot of times we assume an attached kind of hope. Now, going back to the sharing, you can kind of see in attached hope in the top part of the slide, it's dependent on a particular outcome. I'm going to talk about myself for a minute. Sometimes I have goals for politics or goals for myself or my family, and when they don't pan out, I feel a lot of different feelings of frustration, sometimes overwhelm, sometimes despair. And this is really from the Buddhist lens of attachment. This is, how the Buddhist lens would define this as suffering, right? I suffer. And the suffering from this Buddhist perspective is not because of what happened. The suffering is because of my attachment to a particular outcome. And when we talk about hope, sometimes we just assume that the only kind of hope there is an attached kind of hope. And what I want to try to help us wrap our minds around today is the possibility of non-attached hope. So in the top, it talks about hope for outcomes for self, for others, for the world. And then non-attached hope is at the bottom half of the slide, is outcome independent. And it's looking at the idea of hope, not necessarily like, I hope this thing happens, but a sort of general feeling of expectation and trust. When you look up the word hope in the dictionary, you actually get both of these kinds of definitions of hope. Sometimes it's about a specific event, and sometimes it's just a general attitude or space of trust or expectation or hopefulness. Okay, so stopping the share. How's everybody doing with this idea of hope? I'm going to look at those of you who I can see. And does anybody, we're going to talk more about it. I see some thumbs up. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions that you want to jump in with right now?
What's like an example of like a non-attached hope?
Yep, exactly. So that's what we're going to get to next. Thank you for that segue. Yeah, I think this is the big question, isn't it? And this is exactly why we're talking about hope. Okay, so going back to the sharing. Okay. The next slide is about non-attachment in general. And non-attachment and mindfulness kind of go hand in hand in this approach. So one thing that can be helpful is to take a minute and just think about what are our sources of suffering. Maybe each of you can do that for a minute. I actually want to just pause and just mention that if there's any way you can get your hands on paper and a pen or a pencil, that will be helpful for the purposes of this workshop. Actual paper and an actual writing utensil versus typing. So I'm just going to give you a few seconds. I see some people moving around because in this day and age, we don't always have that all the time like we used to. And maybe while people are moving around, we can just think for a minute about what are the sources of suffering for us right now. We can think about it in terms of the pandemic, talking about ourselves, right? Just ourselves. The pandemic, we can think about climate change, and we can just think about our lives in general. And if you want, you can jot a few of those down on your paper once you have that. But as you're thinking about this, take a minute and just think about each of those things that you feel like is a source of suffering, and ask yourself, am I able to identify what I am attached to? What is my attachment? Is there a way that I can think about that suffering in terms of attachment so that I can identify what am I attached to that's causing the suffering? Because it's a little bit counterintuitive. We think that it's the climate change that's causing our suffering, right? Or we think that it's something else, right? Maybe a relationship isn't going the way that we had hoped, or when we try to talk to somebody about the urgency of the pandemic and they're not understanding and they're not responding the way that we were hoping for, right? What's our attachment? Is our attachment to things in the climate working out a certain way? Is our attachment to someone coming around to our way of thinking? Sometimes people find this really frustrating with family members and loved ones, right? I want to talk to you about this, and you're simply not, quote unquote, listening to me. You're not hearing me. You're not changing your mind or your behavior and taking precautions. So I'm attached to you agreeing with me, or I'm attached to you surviving this pandemic, whatever it is. Sometimes it's helpful just to be able to identify, what am I attached to here that is leading me to feel frustrated or hopeless, frightened? And it feels radical. I recognize that. I am not trying to say that this is easy. However, it actually is very simple. And unfortunately for us, a lot of the most simple things are not the easy things. But it's a useful tool to be able to identify that and then say, okay, maybe I need to work on trying to learn how to be non-attached about that thing. Okay? So in the slide, we talk about mindfulness and non-attachment, and I have two exercises we're going to do in a minute. One is a mindfulness exercise, and one is a more about attachment. And like I said, they go hand in hand. And one of the keys to this approach is that we are not beating ourselves up here in any way for suffering or for being attached. It is completely healthy and normal to want things. It would be a little odd not to, actually. And so we want our children to have a planet. We want our loved ones to survive. We want the pandemic to work out okay and not turn into a nightmare any worse than it has to. We want a lot of things, and that's normal, and that's as it should be. The tricky and kind of counterintuitive thing about non-attachment is that it's not about apathy. Letting go of our attachment to things doesn't mean we don't care about them. It means that we're no longer draining a lot of our energy in fear and franticness and frustration. And what that does is it frees up energy for us actually to work on the things that we care about. It actually gives us more energy to work for the things we care about when we're not attached to the outcome. I know it seems counterintuitive. It's just, that's what happens. So one of the points I'm trying to make here is it's unhelpful for us to beat ourselves up about any of this. If we're suffering, it's because we're loving people who care. And when you do work in mindfulness, what they say is turn toward that, embrace that. The way, if you had, for example, a child or a niece or a nephew or a neighbor who was young, a little kid who was suffering, maybe something bad happened to them, or maybe they fell and scraped their knee and they ran toward you crying. What would your reaction be, right? You would crouch down and you would open your arms and you would hold them in a big hug. And that's what we should be doing with all of our suffering inside of us, is we should be turning toward it and embracing it lovingly, compassionately. That turning toward our suffering actually enables us to first of all, to be mindful about it. It gives us a mindfulness about it, which enables us not to feel like our suffering is all of us. It's 100% of us. It helps us kind of put a boundary around it a little bit, actually, and see that there's more to us than our suffering. We are bigger than our suffering. And it also will help us then move through our suffering so that we can try to embrace a place of non-attachment. I'm going to pause again and look over here where I can see all of you and ask if anybody wants to ask any questions about this. Nicole, I promise we're going to talk more specifically about hope too. Is everybody kind of understanding what I'm saying about how ironically being non-attached actually gives us more energy to work for the things that we care about? Okay. Yeah, great. Okay, so we're going to stop sharing for a second. And we're going to do something called the 3-minute breathing space. So I just want to say, if you all feel more comfortable turning your video off, you can for this. Because one of the things about this activity is that it can work better if you're able to close your eyes. And some people don't like to close their eyes while they're on video. If we were in a room together, then you could kind of just know that everyone's eyes are closed and no one's looking at you. But this online format, I just want to invite you, if you want to just shut your video off, that's completely fine. Okay, so this 3-minute breathing space is something that I'm hoping will help people. The idea of this is it's something you could do throughout the day. Once you practice it and you get used to it, you can do it anywhere, anytime. It's not intended to be a place where you access your deepest trauma, okay? It's not intended to be. So if you're a trauma survivor, like myself, this exercise isn't intended to release a bunch of trauma. It's meant to be just a short, gentle exercise to get you into a more grounded place. And the more you do it, I think the better it works. So before we do it, I just want to say, from a trauma sensitive perspective, if anyone feels like breathing or trying to be mindful takes you into a place that feels scary because of trauma or whatever reason, the thing that I recommend that might help is this kind of exercise where you imagine that you are from another planet. You're an alien who's never been to Earth before, and you start looking around or listening or feeling with your body, and you just notice things as if you've literally never seen them before, and think about them. And that will help you kind of get out of that place in your brain that might be starting to get into cycles of panic or trauma, and get you kind of back into a more grounded and calm space. Okay. And so just don't feel any pressure to do this in any deep way. It's meant to be a kind of short, gentle 3-minute exercise. Okay. So with that introduction and trauma aware kind of sensitivity, I'm going to lead you through this short exercise. the first thing you're going to do is try to adopt like what you think of as a dignified posture. Hold yourself with dignity. Usually people kind of straighten their spine a little, and maybe their facial expression will become a little bit dignified, proud. Close your eyes if you can, and ask yourself, what is my experience right now? What are my thoughts? You're going to just label them non-judgmentally, kind of just see them in little bubbles. What are my thoughts? And remember, this can be about what's going on with the coronavirus. This can be about climate change. It can also just be about you. But these are thoughts you're allowing to kind of flow through your head without judgment. Just thoughts come in and you see them and you say, okay, that's a thought of mine. And then it can kind of float away. And you take a breath and you ask yourself, okay, what are my feelings? Whatever your feelings are, without judgment, try to approach this with curiosity. What am I feeling emotionally? If I'm feeling anger, that's fine. Just name that. If I'm feeling anxiousness, joy, whatever the feelings are, whatever they're about, acknowledge them, turn toward them. Keep breathing. And then the third thing is you ask yourself, okay, what are my bodily sensations right now? How is my body feeling? Do I feel any areas of my body that feel kind of tight or like they're bracing? Just kind of do a quick scan. It doesn't have to be a deep scan, just a quick light scan. If you see anywhere, maybe your chest, inside your chest sometimes, or your stomach, sometimes in the head. And again, you just notice, just about noticing. And then after you've done those three things, my thoughts, my feelings, and my bodily sensations, we refocus on the breath, breathing itself. So one of the amazing things about our bodies is that our bodies breathe for us. So our breath breathes itself. So we just focus on that for a minute, feeling how when we breathe, it expands our chest or our stomach and then back. And remember, if you need to anchor yourself in the present, just be aware. You may have just dropped down as an alien from another planet. If it starts to feel anxiety producing, just be aware of that ability to distract yourself from that, to move your brain away from that if you need to. But with those three things in mind, your thoughts, your feelings, and your bodily sensations, then what you can do is expand your breathing to an awareness of your posture, holding yourself with dignity. So when you breathe, you're breathing your posture, your facial expression, just awareness of that. And then anywhere where you're feeling tightness or something slightly unpleasant in your body, breathe from that place. Breathe into it and then breathe out of it. And tell yourself as you're doing that, whatever it is, it's already here. Let me feel it. Whatever it is, it's already here. Let me feel it. Okay, I'm going to bring us out of the 3-minute exercise for a minute and back into our workshop. And I hope that, I'm happy to send this to you too. I hope that you might be able to find a way to use this 3-minute exercise to help yourselves if you encounter times when you're feeling ungrounded. to be able to help you move into a space of groundedness. And you can do this really quickly, sometimes even less than 3 minutes, but if you want to take longer, you can take longer. Before we talk more about that, I'm just wondering if anybody has anything they want to share about how that felt.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I practice meditation pretty frequently, but like recently I've like do like the Buddhist, it's like the metta meditation where you're focusing on others instead of yours. Right now that feels not very useful, and this felt much more like it makes me realize I need to ground myself more before I can focus on that kind of compassionate stuff, which is interesting. Because it's really easy to go to that panic mode and trying to figure out how I got there. It's like, yeah, it's good to know.
I'm really glad. Yeah, I think compassion is a great way to get us out of our heads. It's just really important to remember to be compassionate with ourselves too, right? Thank you for sharing that.
Hi, I'm Elena. I was also thinking a little bit about the equation, this equation that I encountered recently, that is pain plus resistance equals suffering, and just applying that to what we're doing right now, maybe with the getting into the body and sitting with the pains that we have. Yeah.
And just breathing in and out of the places of resistance, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that maybe the resistance has to do with expectations. You have an expectation that you're not going to be in pain. And so when you are in pain and you have an expectation that you're not in pain, then there's a discrepancy and that creates the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, thank you.
Great. That's very well said. Thank you. Anybody else?
It looks like Elise has raised her hand. I think you're muted, Elise.
I tried to unmute.
I did. So what I found is I'm a school teacher, so I'm not in school now, and I have a lot of extra time. And I actually have found there are a lot of times where I'll suddenly realize my breathing may be to the bottom of my neck, like I'm not even getting into my chest. And it's just helpful every so often for somebody to remind me, like, you need to really breathe all the way in. Because when you breathe up there, then your brain gets... So this was just helpful.
Great. And sometimes people find ways like to remind themselves throughout the day to breathe or to do a little reset.
Yeah.
Whatever works for you, right? Yeah. Sometimes I actually have to write on my hand. It's the only thing that works. But I'm glad. Okay, well, I don't see anybody else. So in that case, why don't we do the next one? And the next one, some of you may have already done if you came to the workshop I did last weekend, but it's a tiny bit different today. And you're going to need that piece of paper and the pencil. And I know I already had you try to kind of jot down things that are causing you suffering. This is a slightly different framing, so it'd be probably good to take a fresh piece of paper or area of paper. And in this case, and on my slide, I did say where these things came from. And again, I'm happy to send that information to you. But this one is a little bit more about non-attachment. And so instead of just generally suffering, you're going to make a list of all of the things that are stressing you out the most. I mean, it doesn't have to be like 50 things here, but just list like the top 10 things or so, like 5 or 10 things that are really stressing you out right now. And remember, we're dealing with both a pandemic and climate destabilization and everything else in our lives, related or unrelated to that. Chances are you've probably got the biggest, most difficult ones on your list by now. So what we're going to do now, and if you need to keep jotting things down, you can, but as soon as you're done, what you're going to do is on your list, you're going to put a check mark next to anything that you can influence or potentially change, and an X next to anything that's really not modifiable or controllable by you. Okay? sometimes admitting these things can be a little hard for me. So you might find yourself resisting that. I see nods. But if you can try to be as honest as possible, and a check next to anything you can influence or potentially change, and an X next to anything that's really not modifiable or controllable by you. Once you've done that, you're going to take a piece of scrap paper, a little piece of paper that's a scrap piece, and you're going to copy all of the things from the X list onto that piece of paper. So everything you put an X by, you're going to write on a separate little piece of paper. And as soon as you've done that, you're going to crumple it up and you're going to throw it out in the recycling, or tear it up and put it in the compost, or whatever it is you do to get rid of paper in your home or wherever you are. You're going to take that one and just dispose of it. And so then what you're going to do is you take a fresh piece of paper. It can be the back or whatever, you know, if you like to reuse the one you've been using, and you're going to copy all the things that have checks next to them. You're going to copy them onto a fresh list. Okay? And then I see some people are still writing, but I'm going to tell you what the next thing to do. The last part is simply just to pick the one that you want to start working on today or tomorrow, and identify one thing that you want to do. Just one thing that you could do today or tomorrow on the thing that you feel like you want to start working on, or that you can start working on immediately. And what would that one thing be? It can be a process, not a goal. It can be like, I want to think about, I want to explore, I want to look into, whatever it is, one thing going. So this is kind of obvious, right? But the list that had the X's next to it is the list that we kind of need to let go of in terms of our stress, right? It's sort of a little inventory. And, you know, it's not helping us to be stressed about those things. It's kind of revealing spaces of attachment too. I wonder if anybody wants to share how that exercise felt for you. You don't have to raise your hand or anything. You can just unmute yourself and say what you think. Yeah, hey, Nicole.
It felt there's some stuff that I feel like is in a gray area where like I'm not really sure if I have control over it or not. Like especially with like pandemic stuff. It's like I don't know. Some control, but not all the control.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Does it help to just think that through? Like, there are areas where I have control and areas where I clearly don't.
Yeah. It's like if I'm doing everything I can and like bad stuff still happens, then like what else could I have done?
Mm-hmm.
You know? Yeah. Just thinking about that.
Yeah. Were you already in the workshop when we did this last week?
I think so.
This might be your second time in a week.
Yeah.
Did it feel different the second time?
A little bit, yeah. Yeah.
That's good. I think I probably need to do this about once a week, to be honest, myself. So
I struggled with that. I had a lot of stuff in that gray area that was concern about other people, but people that I actually interact with. So I might be able to impact, but some of what's going to happen to them is out of my control. And so sort of that piece of how much can I do?
And sometimes, did you find it helpful to try to tease that out a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, because the only thing I picked that I felt like I totally couldn't control was that I really wished that Trump and Pence would just die, and I realized I couldn't do that. But
not a thing you can do about it.
Everything else I picked were things where, like, I already, like, I'm worried about what I can do. I sort of let go of most of what I could.
Great.
Thank you.
I have one thing. When you first said like things that you didn't have any power over, I just immediately put X's next to everything, because I kind of feel like it's kind of like something spiritual I do is just like admitting that you're powerless over things. That's like, to me, that's what letting go means.
Mm-hmm.
Or I don't know, even of things that I technically can control parts of. But yeah, so I don't know. That's what I immediately said. And then I remember, like, went back and was like, oh, there's actually a couple of these things that I maybe have some power over.
Interesting.
So.
And well, I think part of what your X's are kind of showing, which you already know, is that what you have power over is whether or not you're stressed about them. Right? Like, one reason you put X's by all of them is that you're already aware of that. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, fair, yeah.
I mean, it sounds to me like that's part of what you're saying, is that part of your practices of letting go, right?
Yeah, well, I feel like that was my motivation with being stressed about them, was because I felt like I was powerless over them. So, yeah.
Yep, that's interesting. Yeah, so this exercise, I'm guessing, gets a little bit easier with practice. If you do it, whether it's every day or every week or whenever, however you do it, all of you, you might find that you're able to tease out some of those gray areas more easily, and it's better able to help you let go of stress about things, and possibly take steps toward things that you actually have some influence over. That's the goal of the exercise. And so we're at 2, but we started after 1 because of all of our introductory materials. We're going to go a few more minutes and talk about a kind of the kind of resilient hope that is a little bit of the punchline of this whole section. And I'm going to take you back to my slide and talk a little bit about our attachment to survival, which is completely understandable. I mean, we're kind of made that way, right? Like, humans and all other creatures are meant to want to survive and to try to survive. And so, again, when I'm talking about attachment, it's not that I don't think that we should want to live and survive. It's that it is possible to be non-attached about it. And the only way, I believe, the only way to have a kind of resilient hope in the face of the climate crisis is to have non-attachment about survival, about ourselves and about our loved ones and about the planet and about all humanity, because we all know that we don't know whether we're going to make it. There's a good chance we might, and there's a chance we won't. And trying to pretend that's not true is causing us suffering. And having our hope be something that is attached to that or dependent upon that is a non-resilient kind of hope. It is not the kind of hope that I think is what we need right now. Okay? And letting go of our attachment to survival is not easy. It's something that, when I work on this issue, makes me cry. And that's good. We need to cry about this because it's very painful. The thing that helps me with this is that we're really, quite honestly, not the first people to have to go through this process. Even though this moment right now is unique, this moment in the history of our planet and the history of humanity, it's not a unique moment in cultures. Cultures have experienced this kind of annihilation, Armageddon kind of experiences, and all cultures have developed resources to help understand meaning in the face of annihilation. It's a much broader understanding of meaning. It's a much broader understanding of purpose. And it requires a kind of oops, we've got an echo. There. It requires an ecocentric perspective, that humanity is not the purpose and the goal and the point that the whole earth is. It's very humbling to step back and say, if the earth is going to survive, it may mean that humanity doesn't, and that I may need to accept that the future of the earth won't involve me, and it won't involve us. What's what's amazing about our traditions and the resources they give us is that they don't just give us the ability to face it and grieve it. They actually give us something even more powerful. They give us the ability to face it with joy and with peace and gratitude, which is, I know it's very counterintuitive. In my tradition, people talk about a peace that passes understanding. This is what they mean by that. It doesn't make sense from most logical frames. It doesn't make sense. But it's there. It's really, really powerful. It's something that nothing can ever take away. I'm gonna move to this. I was going to talk about this. All right, I'll just talk about this for a second. This slide actually is more not necessarily about the pandemic. It's more about resilience in general. But as I was putting it together for today, I was thinking about the pandemic, which is why I got confused. And you see on the far left, the first step in this resilience journey is about acceptance. And the reason that it's first is that I really think that this kind of moment of accepting this possibility is foundational to the rest of resilience. And if we're not able to do that work, we're not going to be able to do the rest of the steps we need to build resilience. It's not that we can't do any of these other things. It's that if we're able to do this kind of work, this really hard work of accepting the reality of this possibility, then it will give us a stronger foundation of resilience in order to do these other steps, okay? And as you can see, the acceptance is here, and it leads to this kind of lament that I've seen a lot through Extinction Rebellion and through a lot of other groups of making space for climate grief. That's really great. I think that lament, that climate grief, flows out of this kind of ability to work on this kind of acceptance. And it leads us to this place where we can start to do the strengthening. It leads to these kind of more strategic prioritization, mobilization kind of work that we all want to do. And then in order to keep doing that work, we circle back and do this Sabbath work, the Sabbath work of joy and the Sabbath work of lament that gives us the strength to keep doing all of this work. And it embodies what I call a fierce kind of hope, a fierce hope, which is what I was trying to describe before. And I'm going to give you some examples of that in the next few slides, which I'm hoping you'll all help maybe read through, of that kind of hope that's not attached and that's not dependent on specific outcomes, and that it just comes from the idea that, yeah, okay, it's tough, it's painful, it's even tragic. And at the same time, it's some kind of amazing honor to be here right now doing this. There's something incredibly inspiring about being here right now doing this work. So the ability to embrace that with joy and gratitude, that's the kind of fierce hope that I'm talking about. So here's one, a Maya Angelou quote. Does anybody want to read this?
Sure. A bird doesn't sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song.
Thank you, Rachel. The next one is a quote by Dr. Cornel West. I think probably a lot of you know, is an African-American liberation theologian and activist. The Black seminarians a year or so ago had a panel at the BU School of Theology on race and the racialization of poverty, where they actually brought several people, including Cornel West, and he said this that day, and I wrote it down because I loved it so much. Does anybody feel like reading this one?
I can.
Thanks.
You do what's right, not necessarily because you think it will make a difference right here and now, but because it keeps your integrity. And then that integrity can spread to others. The idea of making a difference makes it all about you. That commodified idea of time, of chronos, needs to be shattered. It's something called kairos. The gospel's always on time. It's offbeat. It's like jazz.
There's nobody like Cornel West, is there? I think I have another quote by him. Yeah. Okay. So who wants to read this one?
I can read this one.
Thank you.
These oppressive systems are mighty, but they are never almighty. What breaks the back of fear? Love. And love is the ability to learn how to die.
Thank you, Rose. So a lot of these are coming from people that are kind of in my tradition, but as I said, every tradition has these. This one here comes from The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, which some of you may be Lord of the Rings fans. I really like this image of Eowyn shouting death. Just shouting it, charging into it, you know, like joyfully. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this story, but these people are really fighting for freedom and justice, and then they realize that they're not going to make it, and they have to decide what to do, and they decide to just ride right into it, right into the teeth of it. And this is the quote that I pulled out from that. I don't know if we have any Tolkien fans here today or anybody else who might want to read this one.
Okay, I'll do this since I'm a fan.
Thank you.
Arise, arise, riders of Theoden. Spears shall be shaken, shield shall be splintered. A sword day, a red day, ere the sun. Ride now, ride. Ride for ruin and the world's ending. Death, death, death.
Thank you. And the last one, it's from a Christian hymn, an old one, it's about 100 years old. It kind of highlights this idea that I've been talking about choosing liberation over survival. When we're able to let go of our attachment to survival, then we can start to embrace liberation in a really different way. And it's, like I said, a kind of fierce hope, a kind of courage that nothing can take away, because it's no longer attached to anything that anybody could take away. So I know that not everybody here is from this tradition, but is there anybody who will, this is the last quote. This is actually the end of this section. Does anybody feel like reading this very short quote?
I can do it. Are ye able, said the teacher, to be crucified with me?
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, so this is the quote I'm going to end this section with. Just, you know, we've got all of them, obviously, but I like this one because it's a question and it leaves me thinking, like, am I able? Am I able? Am I able to choose liberation over survival? Am I able to embrace non-attachment and just like run toward what needs to be faced? So I'm going to stop the sharing of the screen and go back. And before we take our 5-minute break or whatever, does anybody have any thoughts or questions? I hope, Nicole, that I was able at least to begin to answer your question about what that alternative hope looks like, and anybody else who has any thoughts. You can just take a minute now. We've got like 2 minutes before the quarter hour, or maybe we could take 3 or 4 if we need to, just before we end this section.
I think it's so powerful to like have that liberation over survival. Like that's just, I never thought of it like that. But that's just so powerful and so true, you know, like it's so good. Yeah, so thank you for that.
I'm really glad. I mean, I've spent a lot of time crying about this. It's really powerful stuff. And when I think about it and when I read these quotes and when I sing about it, it just releases a lot of gratitude. And sometimes that gratitude is just in the form of tears, even though, because it's painful gratitude, right? And like I said, it's in every single tradition. And of course, I come out of mine, but it's everywhere. And that's the thing I find so inspiring about it. It must be part of what it means to be human, is really deeply to understand that it's okay to let go and embrace liberation for the whole earth. That's okay. We can do that. We literally can do that. And I didn't really know or believe that until I was faced with the climate crisis. And it really taught me that in a new way, which is a gift, you know? Painful gift, but it's still a gift. So yeah. Oh, good. I'm glad. I'm very glad. Well, it's a lot to think about. It'll be something that we can keep processing. And I hope that the 3-minute breathing space will be a resource that can help you as you work your way through these ideas too. But just remember that you have that. And we're going to move into part 2.